Thank you, everyone, for coming out to the Tulsa.net user group tonight. We have Joshua Donovan talking on Azure Policy Governance as code. Joshua, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate this. I've done a little bit with Azure Policy, so I'm excited to know quite a bit more about it. I'm probably even doing a few things wrong, so I'd love to find out what I'm doing wrong and how I can fix that and expand that. And I will have to admit, there's a couple of times I've had to submit an exemption. And so, but I also add a time period. So when the exemption's there, maybe it's for 5 minutes, just so I can skirt by my own rule that I put in. So, so please introduce yourself and take it away.
All right, I'm Joshua Donovan. Some of you may recognize my name and or face because I am part of the Tulsa.net user group on a normal basis. But I do work for Microsoft in Azure support. My team is the ARM team, and one of the technologies we support is Azure Policy. So of course, as things naturally go, I was talking to Sean one day, and now I'm giving a talk, and I had to make these slides up before the talk. So that's some fun times. But as we get into it, we are going to be talking on Azure Policy. So what Azure Policy is and all of that fun stuff. So let's go ahead. And so today we have what is Azure Policy. So we're going to go over a quick overview of what it is, what you can do with it, and that fun stuff. We're also going to look at it in two different perspectives, because these are the two perspectives I see most often. One perspective is as the policy creator, so how to understand and write policy. We'll also be going through a demo on that. And then also, just as common, how to approach Azure Policy as someone who's been affected by somebody else's policy. So how to understand the error that you get and how to troubleshoot and then get past it. So we are going to jump into what is Azure Policy. In general, Azure Policy, at least the definition portion, is, oh yes, Sean, ARM does mean Azure Resource Manager. Sorry, I should have been more specific. But what is Azure Policy? In general, when it comes to the definition, it is one giant if and then statement. So we are part of a developer group here. So this should be relatively easy to understand from the at least definition standpoint, but it is essentially whittled down to one giant if and then statement. But it is so much more. So what can you do with Azure Policy? Azure Policy helps you enforce your organizational standards and also helps you assess your compliance to those standards through the compliance dashboard. We'll be able to see a little bit of that today, but we're not going to dive super deep into the compliance dashboard today. The way I think about Azure Policy is you use it to manage the what and the where of your Azure environment. If you're concerned with the who, so who is doing something, you're going to want to look at identities or RBAC, which is role-based access control. That's going to be more of where you manage who is doing things. But as far as governing what is deployed, so let's say you don't want the super massive virtual machine deployed because of cost, you can use Azure Policy to say, no, don't deploy that. And then you can also manage the where things are deployed. So, you know, locations, which Azure locations do you want to be able to deploy to, and that kind of stuff. If you don't want things deployed outside of central US, you can totally do that. Just as a conceptual thing, Azure Policy runs on the ARM layer, so Azure Resource Manager layer. You can think of this as the layer that you submit your ARM templates to or your deployments to. So Azure Policy can basically affect just about anything that you submit through an ARM template. So any sort of deployments and things like that. Azure Policy cannot manage your application data. Mostly, there's a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, it can't access your application data. So if you're thinking, ooh, can Azure Policy help me delete my VM snapshots every 30 days? That's going to be more in the automation space. That's not really something that Azure Policy can handle. The exceptions to there are two different resource providers right now that are allowing you to manage data. One of those is Key Vault, and the other one is Kubernetes. So with Key Vault, I know you can manage things like certificates through Azure Policy. I'm not actually sure what you can do with Kubernetes, but something on the data layer of Kubernetes. But for the most part, Azure Policy likes to hang out in the ARM layer. So we're going to jump right into our two perspectives. So we're going to start today with the Azure Policy Creator. So we're going to dive into policy structure, how to write a definition, what does an assignment mean and how to actually deploy that, what are exemptions and what is remediation and how to actually deploy a remediation task. On the other half, like we talked about, we're going to also look at when your resources are affected. So if you're troubleshooting a deployment that you were denied by policy, how do you get around that to make sure that your change window doesn't close before you actually get your resources out there? And if at any time anybody has any questions, you can feel free to come off mute and interrupt me. I know I talk really fast, or you can also post in chat. I do have that up. So we're going to start off with the Azure Policy Creator perspective. So from the Azure Policy Creator, we can see that we have the Azure Policy Definition. I know we've mentioned that before, but this is going to be a single JSON document. And this is where you store your business process or your business logic. What you want to happen is created in the policy definition. We're going to look through that JSON here in a second, but this is where your giant if-then statement lives. This is where most of the work is done. It's where you build. Now, on the assignment, this is where you set the scope of your affected resources. So with the assignment, you're taking this definition and saying, I want to apply it to this subscription or this resource group or this management group. So you can assign it at different levels. You can also filter down to specific resource types and things like that in the definition, but we'll get into that here in a second. There is also the policy exemption. So this helps Azure Policy be a little bit more flexible. So if maybe you've got some legacy resources that have been deployed, or you've got something that's just not compatible with the definition, even though the definition is the gold standard, maybe, something makes enough money for your company that it's okay to be exempted. So you can then place an exemption for that resource or that resource group. Basically within the assignment scope, you can set an exemption for specific things. One thing I did want to mention is the exemption does get placed against the assignment. It does not get placed against the definition. So you can have multiple assignments for each definition. Basically, you can say multiple scopes that the definition applies to. The exemption will be applied to the assignment, not to the definition. So hope that makes sense. Moving on, we're looking now at a policy definition. So the policy definition structure is pretty straightforward. We first start off with our properties section here. So this is going to be more of the metadata around what your policy definition is. This is where you're going to try to define it, help other people in your organization understand what you're doing through the display name and the description. One important thing here is the mode. So we're going to talk about this in just a second, but first we've got more metadata. The category, so in this case, it's category locations. The category helps you filter. So if you have a ton of policies in your environment, you can actually filter by category in the portal. So try to make logical categories if you're making them custom, or just use the built-in ones, which you can find in the portal. As far as mode goes, so we talked a little bit about resource provider modes earlier. But as far as the ARM modes, there are two. So there is all and there's indexed. So indexed, we can see here in the example, but all, as it may sound, evaluates everything. It includes all resource groups within the scope, all subscriptions within the scope, and all resource types within the scope. Now, what indexed does, which is different, is it only evaluates resource types that support tags and locations. So there are resources in Azure that do not support tags or locations. So if you're using a policy definition that is only for tags, you probably want to use indexed. It is recommended, though, that unless you know you want to use indexed, go ahead and just use all. A lot of the time, behavior won't act as you expect when you're using indexed, because maybe you're expecting it to do something that has nothing to do with tags or locations against a resource, but it's not touching it. And it might be because you used indexed when you should have used all. Moving on, we've got our parameters here. So this parameter section is how you can help make your policy definition more dynamic. I'm sure everybody's familiar with parameters, but we can pass in our parameters. So they start with these blocks here. So in this policy, we only have the one parameter, and we're passing in the allowed locations. That's parameter name. It's of type array. So policy is a typed language. If you can call it a language, it's written in JSON, but it does require that you pass the type of your parameters. And then it's got some more metadata. So this is going to be presented to the person making the assignment. If they're doing it through the portal, they'll be able to see the description, and it kind of helps them know what they need to fill in. And here we also have the default value. So the default value is if somebody doesn't pass a parameter to your parameter through the assignment, then it will go ahead and just go with West US 2 for this location one, or whatever you put in to your default value. There's another one called allowed values. So that is an array that you can fill out. I don't have it here in this example, but we will see it a little later on. But the allowed values allows you to set a specific amount of locations for this example. So if you wanted it to be Central US, South Central US, and West US 2, you could have an allowed locations. And then in the portal, when somebody's setting the assignment, that would actually show up as a drop-down instead of a field they can enter in. And it would have your allowed values there to just select from. It makes things a little easier if you know you have a defined list of things that can be entered in. But that is our parameters. So moving on to the meat of a policy, we've got our policy rule here. So our policy rule is where our if then statement lives. So we've got our if and then our then. So our if will always contain at least one condition. So here we can see that we are checking the field location and making sure it's in our parameters of allowed locations. If it is not in this allowed locations, it will return false on this condition. And this is why we have the not here. So not works kind of like if you use a bang in C# or something like that, it just inverts the value. So then our not would convert that to true, which we need because we need our if to return true if we want our then to execute. So when our if returns true, our then executes, and we deny because it's not in the list of allowed locations. And this is a very basic overview of a definition, but if anybody has questions, feel free to post them in chat. Looks like I've used this policy to keep Azure resources in the US. Yeah, this is one of the more basic policies. I think that's the main example you get in the portal as well. So within the policy rule, we've got our logical operators and our conditions. So they live inside of the if statement. So our logical operators are things like all of, so that's not olive, but all of. And then we've also got our not logical operator, which does the inverse. There's also an any of. So with all of course, we've got two conditions here. So both of these would have to return true for the all of to return true. Think of it like an and statement. Whereas with an any of, you would only need to return one of these true, and then the any of would return true. You can think of that as an or statement. So that's one thing you can do with logical operators with the all of and any of. Those are two really important concepts to get in policy to be able to make a lot more involved policy structures and policy behaviors. But as far as conditions go, so we've got conditions like equals, not equals, we've got match and not match, and contains and not contains, and in and not in. This one I like a lot because it's kind of special. So when we're dealing with tags, if anybody here has worked in Azure with tags, you know that tags are a key value pair. So when you're evaluating a key value pair, well, in this case, there's a special condition where you can look for the name or the key of that key value pair. So what this policy is doing here is it's using this special condition to check for the name or the key of the tag instead of the value. If you would just use contains here, you'd be looking at the value. And I highly suggest the use of tags as well. Tags are nice. The other thing to look at here is the field. So field is how you reference things that are in ARM. So you can think of this as you're peering into the ARM template of this resource. So the field here, you can think that you're pulling the tags directly off of that ARM template or the resource that is deployed already. So here, when we're looking at field and we're pulling the type, It's important to use type, this specific combination here in Azure Policy, because it will scope what is running in the policy engine down to only things that match this type. So you can actually reduce runtime within the policy engine, which will make, you know, all of your policies run more efficiently by using types and typing down to specific things, because it will ignore, in this case, everything that's not a storage account. So that's another thing to really think about, is when you can, use types. And then we have effects. So effects are after your if condition has resulted in true, we go down to then, and we get to have all of our fun with effects. So effects are really where, so you've qualified everything in your if statement. Effects are where you can actually take action. So effects run in the policy engine in a specific order. So this actually gives you some advantages when you know what the order is. So for example, the first one that runs is disabled. So it checks your policy definition and it makes sure that it's not set to disabled, because if it's set to disabled, it doesn't need to run it. So it would just be a waste of compute. Then after that, modify and append run next. So what modify and append effects do is they can actually inject into your deployments. So if you're deploying a new thing and a new resource and you forgot to add something, but somebody has a modify or an append effect for it, it will inject during your deployment into the ARM template. And that way, let's say there's a deny effect in place. So deny does what it says. It just says, no, you can't deploy this. But a modify or append, because they run before the deny, could actually qualify a resource deployment to be okay with whatever the deny is checking for. So that's a good thing to know, the order of what they go through. We're going to go through each of these effects here in a second so you can see what they look like. But I did really want to go over the order of operations. So yes, you can use, so Alex had a question, can we use biceps for this? Yes, so Azure Policy can be deployed through any of your normal means. It can be deployed through ADO. You can deploy it through bicep. You can deploy it through Terraform. You can use just normal ARM templates. The code for the policy stays the same. So it would look the same as this, but the wrapping around it for your deployment to Azure of these policies would look different depending on what platform you're on. Okay, so then we have audit. So what audit does is it takes no action against the resource, but it does report back to the compliance dashboard. So it comes after the deny. So if you pass the deny, you weren't denied your deployment, you can still be audited for non-compliance. And then there's also the audit if not exists and deploy if not exists. They run at about the same time. These two are special because they can look at the relationship between a parent and a child resource. So what does that mean? So in Azure, you have a parent resource. Let's say it's a VNet. That's the main resource that's deployed. Well, you can also deploy subnets, and you can also deploy virtual network peerings to a VNet. So with audit if not exists and deploy if not exists, you can actually see the relationship of this VNet has these peerings, or this VNet has these subnets. Whereas in a more normal or other effect, like modifier or append, it sees individual resources as individual resources. So these can be very powerful because you can then audit, let's say a virtual network, just to stick with that. You can audit a virtual network based on what sub-resources. So if it does or does not have a certain peering attached to it, you can audit based on that using an audit if not exists. You also have deploy if not exists. It also can do looking at child resources. So let's say something's supposed to have that peering attached. Let's say you're doing a hub and spoke network in a certain region, and you need every VNet to be connected through a peering to the hub. Well, with deploy if not exists, you could evaluate each VNet and go, oh, this one doesn't have the virtual network peering that I was expecting. Let me just deploy it automatically so that it's there. So deploy if not exists can be really powerful. Audit if not exists can be really powerful for reporting, but it doesn't actually do anything other than report back to the compliance dashboard. And then finally, we have our new effect, which is denyAction. If you haven't played with this before, I highly recommend it. So denyAction works similarly to resource locks. So, and I say that because the only action it can deny right now is the delete action. They're saying they're going to add more, but right now it can deny deletes. So in certain scopes, you can actually restrict through policy the deletion of things, meaning you can say, no, you can't delete these resource groups in this entire subscription because it's production. And you can do things like that in policy now, where you don't have to individually lock or use a third-party tool to go through a lock or use PowerShell to go through and lock all of your resources. You can just use policy to lock those resources, and it's not technically a lock, but you can deny the deletion action. It doesn't deny like updates like a lock can. But anyways, it's pretty powerful. It protects your resources. And yes, denying accidental deletion is important. Trust me, it's painful for everybody when that happens. Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to point out that, because I bring up the point of, denying an accidental deletion of our production database. Sometimes we may be trying to maybe delete a database that was in a play subscription, maybe just in a separate subscription, maybe in a different resource group, right? And whatever. And we're thinking we're in our little sandbox environment and we go to run our script. Maybe it's the PowerShell, maybe it's through API, Terraform, whatever, right? And then we realize, oh, shoot, we were actually still logged into the production subscription. And this is where policies really shine in their powers. It's can really be there to help protect you, protect your environment, and maybe even protect you from yourself. So this is why I use policies, and I really suggest other people taking a look at them.
Yeah, no, that's a really good thought, especially because in PowerShell, it's kind of easy to be in the wrong subscription because you have to select each subscription. So that is true. It can help with protecting those deny actions or through denyAction. And yes, you can also use AZ CLI to mess things up too. That is true, Sean. Okay, so that's our basics on effects. We're going to take a brief look at what those effects actually look like. I had someone delete an entire automation account a couple of months ago. Fortunately, Azure support got it back, minus some linkages. I see a denyAction policy in my future. Yes, I will. If I put my support hat on, I will say it is technically still in preview, but I mean, I think it's a great thing. Okay, so if we look deeper into an append effect, so what an append effect does is it can append values to an array on an ARM object. So for our example here, we've got a network ACL or access control list, and we're looking at the IP rules array. So the IP rules array is on the ARM template or resource template of the storage account. Basically, it is a firewall essentially for the storage account. So in this case, this policy is saying it wants to allow this IP or CIDR range to access the storage account. You can do this through an append. So the powerful part of what append will do is if somebody deploys a new storage account, append will actually inject this value into the network ACL if they're deploying within the scope of the assignment. And this will essentially always be there on all of the storage accounts that are within the scope of the assignment. Some limitations on append is it can only affect arrays within ARM templates. So if something's not an array, you can't really use append for it. It kind of makes sense though from the name because you're appending to a list, but that is something to know. The other limitation of append is it cannot do remediation. So remediation is a no-no on append. What remediation is, we'll get into in a second, but effectively what remediation can do for you is it can create a task that will run through your existing resources. So far we've been talking mainly about new deployments and how to affect those. Remediation tasks can affect existing resources so that you can bring your existing environment into compliance with whatever your business rules are. As far as modify goes, so modify is fairly similar to append. It can also add to arrays in a more creative way. It's sometimes a little harder to add to arrays with the modify, but you can do it. And modify also runs during the deployment, so it can also inject information into that ARM template during deployment. You can also see here in the details section for append, it's missing this role definition IDs that modify has. So this role definition IDs is very important. It is what the managed identity that is going to be assigned to the assignment. It's what permissions or RBAC roles that this managed identity will be granted. So in this case, this role definition needs enough permissions to be able to perform actions on storage accounts. So it's probably something like storage contributor. But why this is needed is because a remediation task, which modify can do, requires the use of a managed identity to be able to perform those actions. Without the RBAC roles assigned to it, it wouldn't have the permission to perform those actions. So in this case, you need the role definition ID. There's another new thing in modify called conflict effect. So if two different modify policies are attempting to affect the same resource, it will throw a conflict. So here you're basically just saying, with the audit, you're basically saying this modify will take a step back. I'm not actually going to try to enforce anything. I'm just going to report to the compliance dashboard that this is non-compliant, but I'm not going to fight with the other modify policies. This is the more passive route to take. It's also, in my opinion, depending on your environment, probably the better route to take, because using audit means you're not going to be interrupting people's deployments because you have two modify policies that are fighting against each other. Whereas the other option for this is deny. So if something actually has that happen, and you have deny here in the conflict effect, it will deny the deployment outright, and they'll get the your deployment's been denied by Azure Policy, and it's not a fun day for whoever's trying to deploy that. So down in the operations, though, so in the operations, we get the fun part of where we actually take action. So in this case, we've got an additional condition. So this is like a mini if statement that we can throw into the operations array. I did want to point out this is an array, so you can have multiple operations in a single modify policy. It's not limited to just one. In this example, we do just have one, but you could easily put a comma here and do more down here. But the condition is an additional if statement essentially. And in this one, in this example, it's checking to make sure the API version of what we're reaching out to. So this would be the storage account resource provider. It's making sure that we're using this API version before we move forward. If that returns true, then the field is going to execute, or the field is going to pull down the allow public access and set it to the value of false, which is a good thing. If you do have storage accounts in your environment and they have any form of sensitive data, please turn off allow public access. It's a good thing to do, and you can do that through policy. Moving on, we've got our audit if not exists. So this is where we can dive into the child to resource to parent resource thing I was talking about. So in this case, we've got our if statement here, and this if statement only has one condition. It's pretty simple, and usually an audit if not exists and deploy if not exists, they're usually pretty simple in the if statements, because really what we care about is this child resource. But we're checking to make sure that this is a virtual machine. If it is a virtual machine, then we go down into our then, and then we can start our details. So details is where we get to have all the fun. And this is where we get to set the new type to extensions. So where this is nice is we're looking at extensions in the context of this virtual machine. It is actually linked. Whereas if you were using just a deny policy and you were looking at virtual machine extensions, it would be looking at that extension on its own. It wouldn't actually know what virtual machine it was tied to. But in this case, we're looking at the extension for virtual machine A that we are looking at. And then it's got a second it's got a second if statement here, kind of like we did before, except for this one is called an existence condition. So the existence condition is checking for if this if this virtual machine has an extension on it from the publisher Azure Security with the type of IaaS anti-malware. So essentially what this is doing is it's making sure this virtual machine has anti-malware installed. So it's pretty awesome. And if it does, it will move on and do nothing. If it doesn't, because we're using audit, it will then flag the compliance dashboard for whoever in your company manages that. If that's you, that's awesome. But it will flag that compliance dashboard saying that your virtual machine is not in compliance because it does not have anti-malware installed. And then next, we've got a much longer one, but don't worry, it's not too intimidating. It's very similar to the audit if not exists in the if statement. This time we're looking for SQL Server databases, and we can jump down. If we have a database, we can see that we are looking for the child resource of transparent data encryption. So this is its own resource in Azure, just like with audit, just like if what we're talking about in the audit one, if you were looking at a deny policy and you were looking at this resource, it wouldn't know what database it was on. It would just know that it exists. But with the if not exists effects, we can then see the relationship between these two. So we can say that on this database, does it have data encryption? If it does, we then come down here, and if you've done anything with ARM templates, this should look very familiar to you. But we have an ARM template that is embedded in this deploy if not exists. It is just like any other ARM template you would ever see. We've got our resources here that do our deployment, and we're deploying the data encryption status enabled to a database. Now, how does it determine if it needs to deploy that or not? Well, with the same existence condition. So we are coming in here, we are checking for this object or resource to exist on the database. We are checking the existence condition of if its status is enabled. If it is not enabled, then we go ahead and deploy that resource using an ARM template that's embedded in the deploy if not exists policy, and it automatically will get kicked out and installed on the resource. One last thing with deploy if not exists that's really important is this evaluation delay. So if you're dealing with resources like databases that can take some time to provision, you don't want policy going in and kicking in the door while it's still trying to provision, trying to then deploy additional resources to that database. So what this evaluation delay can do is, for this example, it's checking for after provisioning, meaning it won't actually execute against this database until the database reports back that its provisioning is succeeded. It's a very important thing. The evaluation delay is not actually required, but if you're dealing with things like databases, I'd say it basically is required. All righty, so we have moved on from the policy definition. So I guess before we move forward, does anybody have any questions about the definitions that we've gone through? So the effects, the if statement, then all of that fun stuff. Or are we good to go?
I don't see any questions as of yet. You might touch on this. I don't know if you're going to or not, but what about if there's an opportunity for a definition that allows it and another definition that tries to deny it? They were built at, say, two different times, and now they're kind of competing. Does the ARM template or does the ARM system, the Azure Resource Manager, actually detect that?
So there is no allow effect. So there is only deny. So in Azure policy, if there's the absence of deny, then it is allowed.
Okay, good point.
Trying to stump me, Sean.
I am trying to stump you, and that's a good case. I was also unfortunately thinking, look, because I've done a lot of work with the IAM in AWS,
Yeah.
and that is a deny first approach that they have. And so if you want to do anything, you have to first allow it. And
So is the
theirs is drastically
IAM?
different.
I haven't done much in AWS in a long time, but is the IAM, that's for identity though, right?
It is identity and access management.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay. So it does both.
yes, it is, and it is policies. The problem is that you have to do policies up front. I say up front, I mean, but if you're going to go towards production in AWS, you're going to be doing some policy management real fast, where with Azure, you can get started in production and never create an Azure policy. So I actually see that as kind of a pro and a con. I mean, it's great to get out the door and get to production. I mean, there's a time to market value with that. However, like I've said earlier, with Azure policies, use it to protect yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's what it's there for. It controls, a lot of the heavy hitters. You can say, no, you can't deploy these so that I don't spend too much in Azure. But you can also protect yourself from deletions now, protect yourself from misconfiguration. That can actually be a bigger deal. So like if you accidentally have your blobs open to the public and they needed to be not open to the public, well, if you use policy, you can at least know about it in the compliance dashboard, or you can even force it to be configured a certain way. So policy is extremely powerful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also encourage people to not only understand policies, but also the ARM template, and maybe not even be a pro at it, but certainly the structure of an ARM template, like you're showing here, when it starts with deployment. What is an Azure deployment? And things like when you create anything as an Azure resource, that's an Azure deployment.
Yep.
So, when you have deployments, and then you can see the history of those deployments through the portal and kind of get a status on this. This is, and I actually did not realize that a policy could kick off a deployment. So, I mean, this is exciting as well. I love this. But I do suggest everyone to kind of understand at least the basic structure of an ARM template. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I'm actually going to show a trick in one of the demos how to get started with ARM templates really quick. So let's say if you're an ADO or GitHub Actions shop, or even Terraform, not so much because you have to follow the Terraform format, but you can at least get started with ARM templates really quick just by exporting the ARM template from what your portal deployment would look like, and we're gonna show that in the first demo. So it's pretty exciting. Okay, so the policy assignment, we're going to move on from the definition. The definition is the meat and potatoes of Azure policy. It's where you do all the fun stuff. It's where you can do the crazy stuff like deploying stuff from Azure policy, which I also agree is very cool. But the assignment is where you set your scope. So right now what I'm showing on screen is the format of the JSON for a policy assignment. Unless you're deploying through code, so if you're using PowerShell to deploy your policy, or ADO, Azure DevOps, sorry, or you're using GitHub Actions or some other form, you can also use Terraform to deploy policy. In that instance, you would need to know how to format a policy assignment, which is what we're seeing on screen now. Most of the time, especially when you're just getting started with Azure Policy, you're going to be doing it through the portal. And the portal makes a nice UI for all of this, and you'll never see the JSON for it. But essentially what Azure Policy does is it sets the scope. So it says, I want to enforce this definition that I made on this resource group only, or this subscription only, or this management group only. You're setting your scope on what is being enforced through the assignment. You're also taking advantage of those parameters that you would put into your definition so that you can have different scopes, have different values for those parameters. So you can pass in a different parameter in this resource group versus that resource group so that your environments can be different. So let's say if you have a tagging definition and you're setting environment and you know that this resource group is dev and this resource group is production, then you can go ahead and set those parameters to autofill for production and for dev in your policy assignment if you want to set those tags automatically through policy. And then it will take care of it that way. So I hope that makes sense. Next, we're looking at the exemption. Exemptions very similar to the assignment, as in, unless you're doing deployments through ADO or GitHub Actions or anything else, you're probably never going to really care about looking at the JSON for it, but this is the structure for an exemption. Again, the exemption is placed on the assignment, and that is why you have to reference the assignment ID. So this is the ID of the assignment that you're exempting against. And there's a really easy UI for doing this in the portal. We're not actually going to go through a demo on that today, unless you guys want to after the fact, but exemptions are pretty simple. They are there to exempt certain resources that technically live within the scope of your policy assignment, that technically apply. So there's a question of applicability. So they apply to that policy definition. But for some other reason, so maybe political, maybe it's a legacy item, it can't actually comply with that policy. So it's always showing as non-compliant. Then you can put in a waiver through exemption. By waiver, I mean the exemption category. You can put in a waiver through an exemption for that resource, and then it'll show in your compliance dashboard as exempt instead of as non-compliant. So it looks pretty on all the reports, but also it keeps it from any like modify policies from modifying it, and deploy if not exists policies from deploying against that resource, as long as you exempt it from those assignments. So moving on, we get to finally start having fun. I know we went through the trenches there for a bit, looking at a lot of JSON, and that can be boring. So we're going to get into our first demo. So what we're going to do in this demo is we're going to create and assign a policy. I have a nice example policy already drawn up for this. It is located on my GitHub. And if you're interested in any of the links that I have here, the slides and all of these links are also on my GitHub, and I'll have a link for that at the end. So don't worry about racing to write any of this down. You'll have access to it, don't worry. But we're going to go over business requirements for this policy definition. So in this case, we want to pick a policy that goes against Azure Key Vault, and we want to make sure that the network access control list contains our company's IP CIDR ranges. We also need to make sure that this business rule includes the production subscription. So what this tells me is the scope of the assignment needs to be assigned to the subscription level, not to the resource group level, and not to a management group level. For the sales department, in this case, the subscription is going to be called demo, but you can pretend it's called sales. We also want to ensure that these CIDR ranges are present, but we don't want to restrict others from being added. So essentially, we want to add these three, there's going to be three. We want to add these three CIDR ranges to our access control list, but if there's a fourth or a fifth that's there for application reasons, then we don't want to accidentally remove those and replace them with just these. We want to make sure they stay there as well. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our browser. So, all right, so we're in our browser and we're going to go to GitHub first. So this is a description of this example policy that we're going to be using. So if you're interested on how this policy functions in depth, feel free to come here and read through this. I try my best to describe what each function is doing so that you can really understand. But this is the policy that we will be deploying. We can see that the mode is all, so it goes against all resources. We're not doing a tagging policy or a location policy, so by default, we should be using all. We can see that we have our policy rule here. We have our if statement. So this if statement must return true. meaning this all of, because I don't have anything else, this all of must return true for us to then take effect. So what are we looking for? First, we're looking to make sure that it's a key vault. So we're using our type. So we're focusing that assignment down on just the key vaults, and we're not going to accidentally, or not accidentally, but unnecessarily scan a bunch of other resources. And then what we're using here is a value. So I know we've been talking a lot about field. So field is how you access values that are in the ARM layer for that resource. You can think of it as accessing the ARM template directly. Well, with value, we have some extra power there because we can use just about every ARM template function that exists. The ARM template functions can be used in value for you to do some really powerful things. In this case, we're using the equals function to validate some things. We'll dive into that in a second. We're going to dive deeper into the middle first, though. So first, we're using intersection. So intersection is an ARM template function. Intersection is going to first use field. So there is a field function, so you can still access those ARM layer resources within a value. And we're going to pull down the current list of IP rules that's on this key vault. We're then going to do an intersection with the parameters that we're passing in through the assignment. And what intersection is going to do is if for whatever exists on the IP rules and exists in the parameter, it's going to return that. So if they match, they get returned. So this intersection function is going to return everything that matches. And then we're going to compare it to our parameters, which is then going to make sure they equal, because if they equal, then all of the IPs that we want to add are already on the key vaults network access control list, so we don't need to do anything. But if they do not, then we return true, and this all kicks off. Next in our then, we have our conflict effective audit. It's just a good practice. We have our role definition ID. So again, if we're going to do remediation, which that'll be the next demo, if we're going to do remediation, we need to have the proper permissions. This one is deploying Key Vault contributor so that it's able to update the IP rules. And then we have our operations section. So this is where we're going to add or replace the IP rules on the network access control list. And what we're doing here is we're doing another where we're adding in the ARM template functions. We're doing a union of the existing IPs with the new IPs that we want to make sure are there, and then updating the field of IP rules on the resource through add or replace. So in the operations, you can have add, you can have remove even, or you can have add or replace. Add or replace is kind of a safety net because with add, you can get conflicts there. So add or replace, if something already exists, it will replace it. Remove is another one that you can use here. Remove is pretty cool because let's say you've got a tag in your environment that you don't want to be there anymore. You can write a quick policy, a quick modify policy, use a remove operation to remove that tag from your environment through remediation. And then you can just, if you're done at that point, you can delete the policy after that. But it kind of helps with that automation a little bit. Next, we can see that we're passing in an effect parameter. So that's just so that I can disable this policy definition without having to do any code changes. And then we have our CIDR ranges that do have a specific format they have to be passed in. This is a limitation on the key vault side, not on the policy side. Key vault accepts only key value pair items for the access control list, and they have to have a key of value, the string, and then your CIDR address is the value. But we're going to go ahead and grab this policy, and we're going to go ahead and deploy it within Azure. So to deploy a policy in Azure, we can go straight into policy. So if you don't have it there, you can just type in policy in your search. It'll come up. I think it's usually, you might have to go to all services on that side. I usually like the search bar. So policy, we get into our policy. So this is our first glimpse at the compliance dashboard. When we get into the remediation step, we're going to dive deeper into this. But if we go into definitions, we can go ahead and add our fancy new definition. Now this is something that can take a little bit to load, sadly. So we're going to add our policy definition. We're going to add it to our demo subscription. You can pretend that that says sales like the requirement says to. We're going to name it Key Vault must allow my IPs. And then here's the category. So this is something I briefly touched on. It helps with filtering your policies. So you can use existing categories, which in this case, we're going to use Key Vault, or you can create your new if you have company specific ways you want to filter. And then whenever you're using policy through the portal, it's going to give you this nice example policy. So this is kind of like the hello world of Azure Policy. It's your allowed locations policy that we did look at as our example. But this will be, if you're ever curious, you need to pump out a policy real quick, but you don't quite remember the format. If you come in here and just click new policy definition, it's going to give you the format in this example of the allowed locations. But we're going to go ahead and just delete that and paste in our Key Vault one, because that's what we want. And we can see here that it does define what role definition we're giving it, even though in the policy, you have to pass it as the GUID. It does define it here so that you know what you're saving. But we can see that our policy definition has been created. So this is our business rule. It exists now, but it's not assigned anywhere. It's not given a scope, so it's not being enforced on any resources. So that's where we're going to go through the assign step. So if we click assign, we can then see this is the assign workflow. So in assign, you can set the scope. So right now it's set to the subscription because that's the level that the definition was saved at. If you're doing stuff with management groups and you want to deploy your policy through management groups, what management groups allow you to do is to be able to affect multiple subscriptions at once. You would have to deploy the definition at the management group level to be able to set the scope at the management group level. But here we deployed our definition to the subscription. So we have the option to select resource groups in here, but our requirement was to set our assignment at the subscription level. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. You can set your assignment name and description. If you're doing anything in production for your company, definitely suggest filling this out with a bunch of detail on what your things are doing. For here, we're just going to move on. This is something new. We're only going to touch on it briefly, but resource selectors and overrides are very new to Azure Policy. What resource selectors let you do is it lets you select down and allow for gradual rollouts of your policy. So for example, if I'm setting this at the subscription level and the subscription is in South Central US and Central US at the same time, I can use a resource selector to set it to only enforce this policy in Central instead of South Central, or I can have it only enforced in South Central, only affect one area. So if something's not acting like you expected, you're not affecting your entire production environment. Overrides affect your policy by excluding things. It's kind of like a different way to put an exemption, kind of. They're a little different. They're also new, though. There is really good documentation on this in the documentation links if you are interested in using resource selectors and overrides, though. Next, we have our parameters. So we are in the assignment. So we need to assign the parameters for this scope. We can see here when I was talking about the allowed values providing you a dropdown, this is what I was talking about. Because I have the allowed values in this policy set to modify or disabled for the effect, you can see that I can easily just do a dropdown and select what's allowed. As for the other parameter, that one needs me to pass in an array. So we've got our array here, and I'm going to grab what we're passing in. So for this one, we need to format our array because we're doing that union. We need to format our array in the proper format for what Key Vault expects. So in this case, we're passing our value and our CIDR ranges. So with Key Vault, you have to use public IPs. So I am just using the public IPs for the Microsoft.com website. So if you're wondering what those are, but that is what we're going to pass in to our policy assignment. Next, we have our remediation tab. So this is the tab where your system assigned or your user assigned managed identity, you can use either with policy, are created. So with policy, I typically like to lean towards system assigned because it will be created and deleted with your assignment. So if you delete your assignment, it's going to go ahead and clean up that managed identity. With user assigned, if you need specific permissions, or maybe you don't have permission to grant permissions, then user assigned might be better. When you're saving your assignment, if in your environment, you are not granted permission to give other users permissions, then you will still be able to save the assignment, but remediation won't be able to go through because your managed identity doesn't have the RBAC permissions assigned because you did not have permission to grant it. I hope that makes sense. But in here, if you're sure that you want to clean up your environment at the time of assignment, this makes it really easy. You can just select the create remediation task and it's going to go ahead and create that for you. We're going to do that in the next demo though. And then we have our non-compliance message. So this is where you can put your company specific information into. If somebody gets denied by your policy, they will be given this message. So you can say, something like cloud security department, contact us at our, by submitting a ticket to this bucket, whatever you need to do there. With non-compliance message, I always suggest that you fill it out in a way that it describes not only why the person was denied, so you've got to know what this definition is doing and tell them why they were denied. And we'll see why that's important in the troubleshooting demo coming up. But you need to tell them why they were denied and who to contact, because if they reach out to Microsoft support, the only thing we're going to be able to tell them is go talk to whoever deployed the policy assignment, because we can't help you circumvent your company's policies. So it's important here, if you are going to use a compliance message, I personally am fine with the default. The default's extremely descriptive, but it doesn't tell them where to go if they need to talk to who created it. I'm going to leave that blank for now. And we have our normal review and create, where just one pane of glass tells you everything you're doing. And then we can go ahead and create this policy assignment. So we can see that the policy assignment succeeded, and now we have a policy assignment. So with Azure Policy, usually, most of the time, it will take effect within 30 seconds to a minute, but it can take longer than that. So for the sake of this demo, I've got one that's already, in the oven. It's already baked in. And we can see that our key vault, it's the same definition, but we can see that we've got some non-compliant resources here because they don't have these IPs. They're very bad key vaults. So we're going to jump into the resource group that I have these key vaults deployed to. And first things first, we're going to create a new one. So what this is going to demonstrate is we are using a modify policy. So this is going to show that when this policy is deployed, I'm not actually adding these IPs in the deployment, but the modify policy is injecting them into the deployment at the time of deployment. So we can see that I've deployed several key vaults. So it's in my quick find section, which is fun. But we've got we can just say my awesome key vault, and is already in use. Okay. Demo. Yeah, there we go. So we've got our region, which we're going to pick the best region of all, South Central US, because it's close. And then we're going to go to the networking tab. So if you remember, our definition has to do with networking. It has to do with the access control list. So we're going to go ahead and select the select networks. Someone else has an awesome key vault. Yes, I know. It's crazy, isn't it? So we're going to set our public access to select networks. This uses the integrated firewall within Key Vault so that it can't be public, essentially. So we're going to go to the review and create tab. So in the review and create tab, we're going to take a look. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where you can export your templates automatically. So you can come into the portal, you can build out your resource exactly how you want it. And then if you click this view automation template button, it actually will give you your automation template exactly how you have it configured through the portal. So, and it'll also do the fancy stuff of setting up a parameters file for you. So it looks all nice and professional. We can see here that our network access control list is in a parameter. So we're going to check out the parameter file. We're going to go down to our network access controls, and we can see that our IP rules, which is what we're focused on with our definition, is empty.
Hey, Joshua.
Yeah, what's up?
If I could point out something over on the template side of it.
Yep.
Going back down to where it shows a type, not in the parameters, but further down. I know, like when we're talking about storage counts or SKUs, or when we're trying to limit it to a type of resource.
Yes.
This is where I have used the ARM system, if you will, to tell me specifically what that spelling is, right? If I'm looking at Microsoft.storage account, or in this case, Microsoft.key vault / vaults. So notice that the type is more specific. I've used that when I was developing my policy definitions. So I could go back to something that already exists. I could export that template, and I will grab that type, and I know exactly what I want to add and how I want to tweak that a little bit. So I just wanted to point that out, that that's kind of a cheat on how you can find the exact spelling of a particular resource because Microsoft's looking for that, or Azure is looking for that explicit type by that definition right there.
Yes, exactly. And give me just a second. I'm going to pull up the ARM documentation. So if we take a look at the ARM documentation with our nice Microsoft build ad, remember, go check out Microsoft build. If you go to the ARM documentation, so Bicep and ARM templates, you can browse every single resource that is available on ARM. And you can go into, for this example, we went into Key Vault, we selected vaults, and that'll show you the same thing. It'll show you the type. So if you want an easily browsable way to do this, you can come into the Azure you can't see my title screen, but it's the Azure /templates documentation. And then you can browse every single thing in here and go to and find out what the type is. So this is actually what I do if I'm troubleshooting in an Azure policy, is I'll come to this documentation because it's really easy to find, like, oh, they're doing an OpenShift cluster. So I just select that, and that tells me exactly what the type needs to be. So that's another way to find it.
Yeah, that's extremely handy.
I'll paste this in our chat too. Going to be the OpenShift clusters link, but yeah, so this is what I use, and it makes it great. If you're developing, I know it's a little bit off topic, but if you're developing for Bicep, ARM, or Terraform, this documentation is extremely valuable because it'll give you exact examples of the formatting that you have to do to be able to deploy these things in whatever language your company prefers. So that's also here as well. But if we jump back here, we are in the middle of deploying. So we've validated that our parameters for our access control list IP rules is empty. So we can exit out of the template. Feel free to use this. This is a great tool though. Like I said, configure things to UI, and then you can just click view automation template, export it. You can export it from here. I forgot to mention that. You just click download and it'll export it for you. And then you can literally go from this straight to ADO or GitHub Actions or whatever you're using, put it in there and say deploy, and it works. When we go to our code version of the example for troubleshooting, that is actually what I did. I came in here and just exported the automation template, and it works right off the bat. It's great. But we're going to go ahead and create our key vault. Luckily, key vaults are fairly quick to deploy, just about as quick as anything else.
You know, when we were talking about deployments themselves earlier, this is a deployment, right? I mean, it's deploying and to create or modify an Azure resource. So this is a prime example of that.
Yes, this is a deployment. This is actually a deployment record. This is what you would see on your resource group. So if we go to resource Real quick, I'll show that in here, we can see our CIDR addresses from our modify were injected during deployment, and they are now showing on the access control list for the Key Vault firewall. So that's the power of a modify, is you can inject that in there. And then if we go out to our resource group, you can see the deployments. You know, I've tried this a few times. You can see the deployments are available in here. So you can see not all of your history, but you can see a lot of your history. They do fall off eventually. You can see your history of your deployments, see how they went, if they had errors. If they had errors, you can also do the debugging in there as well. But if we go back here, okay, so we've got our awesome Key Vault. It deployed with the modify policy, but now we have these two other Key Vaults here that were existing before we made our assignment. So if we go in here and we look, we can see that it's got this one address. I don't know what this address would possibly be for, but it's here, but we don't have the required ones from the business. So one of the other really powerful things about append and modify is anytime somebody updates a resource, updating a resource is then another deployment. So if I go here and I say allow trusted Microsoft services to bypass this firewall, and you know I won't need to allow storage account access or something like that, and I hit apply, well, I've now updated my Key Vault, which then does another deployment to update the Key Vault record. So if I refresh, all of a sudden we can see that our modify took effect and it added these in. Another really fun part about this is if you've got a application owner that doesn't want these here and they come in here and they delete them and then they apply, they're gone. But if they refresh, they come back. So that's the beauty of a modify, is it enforces that those are there, even if somebody tries to delete them. So if you have something that's super important to be there, check out modify policies. They're amazing. Deploy if not exists are similar. If somebody deletes that resource and then there's an update on the parent resource, it'll redeploy as well. So you can actually have full ARM templates be deployed automatically in that fashion. But that comes to the end of our first demo. So if we jump back into here, let me erase all my lines. So we successfully deployed our example policy definition. We assigned it and then we tested it as well. Next, we have remediation. So remediation is a really big topic. It's something that some people don't fully understand when they first start doing policy. A lot of people expect policy to work automatically against your existing resources, but this is actually something that it doesn't do on purpose, because we don't want to wreck your production environment if somebody's not already making a change to your production environment. So if somebody's not updating that resource or deploying a new resource, policy is going to be like, hey, my hands are off. I'm not touching it. It will show as non-compliant in the dashboard, but it won't automatically take action against those resources. So what you can do, what you can do if you want to take action against those resources is you can remediate them. So remediating is its own task. It's basically like a run job. It's its own task. And you can deploy it just like everything else in Azure Policy through a pipeline, through Terraform, whatever you want. If you do it through code, you need to understand the JSON structure and you need to pass that through. Basically, you're telling it what assignment you want to remediate, and then you can do things like limit it to a certain amount of resources, how many parallel deployments, what your failure threshold is before it just gives up, and that kind of stuff. We're going to do it through the portal because the portal's prettier to look at, but we're going to go ahead and do that now. So if we jump back into our browser, we can see, like I showed before, we had two. So we had our central and we also have the South Central Key Vault. So the South Central Key Vault has another one of these curious IP addresses that I don't know what they're from, but we don't have our required IP addresses here that we need for our business rule. So if we come back out, there's a nice link here on every resource group that you can jump directly into the policies for, and it'll also be scoped into that resource group. So it's a really easy way to take a look at the compliance dashboard. But we can see here on our compliance dashboard, if I select our demo policy here, the baked in one, we can see that we have two non-compliant resources. Now, if you think about it, wasn't Central US just updated? Why is it still showing as non-compliant? So the policy engine scans resources on a schedule. It's not automatically going to update just because something has updated on the key vault as far as compliance goes. So this simply just hasn't updated yet. Eventually it would pick it up and then it would show it as compliant. But with a remediation task, we can come in here. I guess I clicked that a little quick, so let me jump back. So in the compliance dashboard area, you can see at the top, you can go look at the definition directly. You can edit the assignment directly from here. You can also create the remediation task, which is what we're going to do. But you can also create an exemption directly from here because the exemption goes from the assignment. It makes sense that when you're looking at the assignment, you can create an exemption from here and it'll be pre-scoped in for you in that user interface. But if we select create a remediation task, we're now in the remediation task builder window. And we can see that we have two resources here that are up for remediation. They're up for remediation because they're non-compliant. They're non-compliant because they're key vaults and they don't have the IP rules available. So if we wanted to triple check that we're not going to affect the Central US one because we know it had the change, there is a checkbox here called reevaluate resources. What this does is this is going to run the policy engine scan before it goes and tries to do the remediation. So that would actually pick up the Central US one, and therefore we wouldn't remediate against it. That does take a significant amount of time, so I'm not going to run that. And I also know that this update doesn't break anything and these resources don't mean anything. So we're going to move forward with just remediating. So I clicked remediate, we get the nice remediation task created successfully, but how do I go view what the remediation task is doing? If you come back to the policy compliance dashboard where we can see our list of assignments, you can see on the side there's this remediation area. We can click on the remediation, come in here to remediation tasks, and we can see that my remediation task is already done because I was too slow. But we can click into it. If this was still running, you'd see a little pending symbol and it would say if it was accepted or if it was running. We can see that it's already succeeded and it's already been applied against these two resources. So if I go ahead and select a resource and go to it, which this is our central one, we can see that it still has those IPs that it did before, but the remediation task didn't break anything. And then if we come in here and we go to the South Central one, which did not have it, we can see that they've been added through a remediation task. Now, the difference between what we saw before when the resource was updated is somebody took an action that created a new deployment, which then deployed this modify, these values through the modify effect. Whereas with the remediation, nobody had to touch the resource at all. It was just existing in our environment. And we decided on our schedule that, hey, at this time, we're going to go ahead and update that resource automatically. Well, semi-automatically, we're going to trigger it. And then it will go ahead and update, and maybe we need to submit a change window because it's a production resource or something like that, or a production subscription. But remediation tasks give you control over when those updates happen, which is really cool. Okay, so that is basically all there is to remediation. It's pretty simple. If you do have errors when remediating, your remediation task will show the error on the specific device, and then you can go to related events, which will just take you to the activity log, and it'll show you what went wrong, what errored out, that kind of stuff. But that is, in general, our remediation. Okay, we're almost there. So next, we've got helpful links. So we're at the end of our Azure Policy Creator section. So this is the heavier half of this talk. But I've got a bunch of links here for all of the definition, structure, effects, scope, all of that documentation. I've also got here this built-in repository link. So this will take you to the official Azure GitHub for built-in policy definitions. So built-in policy definitions are the ones that are preloaded when you look in your Azure portal. They are official Microsoft supported policies. So they're a great starting point if you want to create your own policies that maybe do slightly different behavior. You can go into this repository, simply grab what policy is there and build off of it so you don't have to start from scratch. Similarly, there's a community policies repository. This is sponsored by Microsoft, but it's a community policy resource, meaning that not everything in here is by a Microsoft resource, and they may not be actually supported, even though they should be pretty good for your use. They should be fairly vetted by the submitter, and they should be up to a certain standard. But community policies have a lot more out-of-the-box things that they can do. So if you've got a really weird business requirement, you're not really sure how to tackle it, I would say check out the community policy repo and see if somebody's already done it, because chances are somebody's probably already done it, and it's likely to be in the community policy repo. As far as other resources that you can use, I've got a link to the AZ Policy Advertiser website. So this is a amazing website if you want to get super nerdy with Azure Policy. It's got, you know, whenever a policy gets updated, it's got a change log there, and it's pretty crazy. This is built by a Microsoft employee who is extremely passionate about policy, but it is not, it's not an official Microsoft website. It is their hobby website, but it is a great website, and that employee is not me. You might want to touch on existing policies and definitions and how people can use and or modify. Oh yes, we can do that. Let's do that. Let me get my browser back up. Okay, so with Azure Policy, if we go back into the main policy portal, and you come down to definitions where we did when we were creating our own policy, once it loads. Okay, so we've got different policy types. We've got built-in and we've got custom. So custom policies are policies that I created or you created, and you clicked this plus policy definition or you deployed it through a pipeline. These are your policies. If you go into one of these policies, so let's say we go into the baked in one that I made, you can actually come in here and you can edit this definition right in the portal. And you can edit it, save it, and you're all good. Now with built-in, you can come in here and you can find a ton of already built-in policies. So for example, I know Sean likes to talk about his policy that he has that limits virtual machine SKUs. So there is one, I believe, for virtual machine SKUs that is built in. Let me see, allow virtual machine size SKUs. So this is a built-in policy definition. It's just here for your use. You can see that it's built in and you cannot edit it. So you cannot edit this built-in because it's provided, but you can go ahead and assign it and then fill in your list of allowed SKUs. So let's say you have a specific list of allowed VM SKU sizes, and then you can pass that list as your parameter and use it in that way. This also uses a great thing that I didn't really touch on, which is called strong type. So strong type are basically predefined allow lists. So we're actually going to go look at this real quick. But you can see that they only have the one line in there that says strong type. But if I go to parameters, you can see that this is loading against ARM. So this is actually pulling the manifest for SKU sizes. And then you can come in here and you can just select them. So strong types are documented. There are a limited list of strong types that you can use. And that list is documented in the documentation, but you can use these too. You can say strong type SKU sizes, and then you don't have to fill this array in your parameter. It gets auto-populated by what SKUs are available. So that's another thing that's really cool. If you want to modify this in the portal without copying it out and editing it in like VS Code, which I would recommend you do, because there is a policy plugin that's really good to VS Code. But if you want to edit it directly in this portal, you can't just click edit, but you can duplicate it. So you can click duplicate, and then it becomes your policy definition. It becomes a custom policy definition, and you can edit this directly in the portal. You can do this for any built-in policy there is, which there are a lot. But if you prefer navigating through GitHub instead of navigating through this portal, all of these built-in policies are available on this repo. This repo here for the built-in policies, that those lists will match up. To the group, you can get policy in search or in Blade or just selecting. Yes, you can. Okay, so that is it for Azure Policy Creator. Unless anybody has any more questions for now, we can also take questions at the end, but I just want to leave that up there if anybody has it. Going once, going twice. All right, moving on. So now the fun stuff. Most of us here are developers. So this is probably the side of policy that you're going to see most. So this section of the talk is about what do you do when your deployment gets denied. So you've worked on your app super hard and you're ready to deploy it into your Azure environment, and you get this nice disallowed by policy or any error in Azure. So if you get an error during a deployment, first thing you need to do is identify, if you're thinking it might be policy, is identify if policy is actually what caused your failure or if it was something else. So Azure Policy has this verbiage here, was denied or was disallowed by policy. That will be used when your deployment is denied by policy. If you have something else in your error, it wasn't policy that blocked you. If it's internal server error, that's something to do with either the resource provider or bad request or something like that. Oh, browser blocking the slides. Thank you. All right. That's better. My bad. Thank you, Randy. So just to go over this real quick again. So these are the errors that you would see if you are actually blocked by policy. You would see this was disallowed by policy message. And also the code is request disallowed by policy. In the portal, you'll see this nice link that gives you a link to the policy definition that blocked you. So that makes it really easy to investigate why your deployment was blocked. You can also go to the additional information tab on this error, and it'll give you a nice readout of exactly why you were blocked. It'll actually tell you what part of the if statement in that definition decided to flag you, meaning what do you need to correct in your deployment. You can also have these non-compliance messages that we talked about in the assignment section. In the portal, those will show up here under reason. So in this case, you were blocked by the Cloud Team Wizards. Not very descriptive, not a great non-compliance message, but it does tell you where to go and who to yell at to hopefully get your deployment through. But that is where that non-compliance message shows up. The non-compliance message being more descriptive becomes a lot more important if you're deploying through a pipeline. If you're deploying through code, I'm going to show you in a second how you can troubleshoot that. But the only thing you will get is this reason. You won't get the policy definition that denied you and that kind of stuff if you're using specifically PowerShell to deploy, which a lot of people are using in like ADO or something like that. And then next, you determine what caused non-compliance. So that would be looking here or evaluating the policy definition. Depending on how restrictive your environments are, you may not be able to view the policy definitions. So you may have to reach out to the team that manages that anyways, for them to help you figure out what's going wrong. And then finally, to get around it, you need to update your deployment to be compliant, or you can ask that team to help you out with an exemption. So moving on, we've got our deny demo. This is going to be the last demo of the day, so don't worry, I'm almost done. So we're going to jump back into our browser again. We're going to go into this resource group that is very well named for being denied. And what this resource group really needs is a load balancer. That's what I think it needs. So So we're going to go ahead and deploy load balancer to this resource group. We're going to say my awesome load balancer. We're going to deploy it to the best region, which is South Central US. We are going to go ahead and select a public type because I want that public IP. We're going to go to our front end IP configuration. And once it loads, we're going to create our new front end. We're going to create a new my front end public IP. And we're going to go ahead and add that in. And then we're not actually going to use this load balancer for everything. So I'm just going to skip over everything else and go to review and create. And oh no. So we can see here that our validation failed. When you're deploying through the portal, this validation step is where policy is going to be scanned against your resources. It makes it a little less jarring than after you click create. So it makes it a little nicer. But from our screenshots earlier, you could see here that it's the same thing. It says what's disallowed by policy. It tells me that company load balancers should not have public IP addresses. So the policy I've deployed, this is the name of the assignment for that policy. So if somebody didn't name their assignment as clear, it wouldn't be as easy to tell that we need to remove that public IP. But if we go into the raw error, we can see what it is looking at. So if you scroll down to the evaluated expressions, which when we show you the code view, this gets actually formatted a little nicer in PowerShell. If you want to look at this nicer, you can copy it out and paste it somewhere else. But we can see here that it's evaluating for load balancers, and we can see that it blocked because I have a public IP address. It's also looking for public IP prefixes, but that's not why I was blocked. So it's not listed here. It's listed here that I was blocked by the public IP. So just from clicking this one tab, I know that I need to go change my deployment to not have that public IP. Now, if we go back to our resource group and we deploy again, balancer. And this time we deploy without that public IP, my not so awesome. Oh my gosh, can't type. Load balancer. We keep it as internal, so it's going to use a VNet instead of using public IP. We can create our front end. My front end, it's using the VNet. We're just going to use default subnet. We're going to add it, go to review and create, and we can see that, hey, we passed. We passed because we didn't have a public IP, just like what the definition was checking for. So I can go ahead and create, it'll create. But while that's creating, we can move on to the second half of the troubleshooting, which is our code deployment. So as we can see here, I've got a template already pre-made out. What I did here is in the portal, I clicked on that automation template and just downloaded it. So this is exactly as it comes. And we can see here that one of the things it's deploying is this public IP address, and it's configuring that public IP address as the front end configuration on this load balancer. So we've got our load balancer type being deployed. So if I want to go ahead and through the PowerShell awesomeness, go ahead and deploy this, we can see that, let me make sure everything looks right. Yes, so I'm going to deploy it. So we can see that we're deploying to the policy demo deployment denied. And this is going to show us the default error message in code. So when you're deploying through code and they haven't set that non-compliance message, you actually get some decent information. You get the policy assignment that denied you. You get the definition that denied you. So you have some places to go. But let's say that they do have a non-compliance message in there. So let's go up to the one that has a non-compliance. Okay, custom message, here we go. So we can see that in this, by the name of this resource group, that this one is going to have a denied with a custom message. So we can go ahead and try deploying there. And you see the difference is that my awesome load balancer was denied because I was denied by the denial king, and that's not very descriptive. It does say, it gives us some hint. It says, see error details for policy resource IDs. So let's say I go into error at the index of 1 because I've done this in PowerShell before and I know how to look at errors. We do select star. I'm going to investigate the error details, but the error details are blank. So where do we go from here? We know that we are disallowed by policy. We know it's because of this denial king guy, but we don't know why. So this is where a very powerful tool, if you do anything in either the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell module, you need to know about the debug parameter. So in Azure CLI, it'll be --debug. In PowerShell, it's just -debug. I am going to go ahead and hide my screen for a second while I first run this because there is some authentication stuff that I don't want to show on screen. And I'll bring it back now. So it has ran, and we can see here. So when you do debug, it'll show you the actual API calls that are being sent to the ARM layer, so at management.azure.com, and your responses from them. This is really good if you're ever gonna contact Microsoft support. One of the things that we really care about is this header here in the response, which is called the XMS correlation request ID. So if you know how to get that by using debug, if you're deploying through PowerShell, you know, you're one step ahead, and that's 10 steps towards getting you a resolution. So this is something that is important to be able to find. But we can see here that in our HTTP response, we sent this. This is our ARM template that's also printed out with everything filled in debug. So it doesn't show it as a parameter. It shows it as filled in. So we know exactly what was submitted to the ARM layer. And then we can also see that we've got a bad request response. The template deployment failed because of a policy violation. And then we can see that my awesome load balancer was disallowed by policy. You've been denied by the denial king. So that's the error we saw earlier. And that message does get translated into PowerShell in the message. So we do see that. But we also have this additional info. This is not being mapped by PowerShell. So this additional info part of the body has all of the details about the policy violation. So we have our evaluated expressions. We can see that it's checking for load balancers. And we can see that I was denied because of a public IP address. So that is one of the ways that you can, when deploying through like ADO or anything else, a lot of the time you'll be deploying from a script. So you'll be using something similar to AZ resource group deployments inside of your pipeline. So you can turn on debug to be able to get this response. It also gives you very detailed information on the policy definition ID, the display name of it, the assignment that denied you, and all of that information that you'll need to be able to figure out what's going wrong and why your deployment is being blocked. Somebody in here mentioned Terraform. There is also a similar way. You set your TF_log to trace, and it will also give you your HTTP call outputs. So you can do it through Terraform as well, if you were wondering there. But that is basically it for debugging. So we can see I've got a second template here already preloaded. The second template is doing the same thing we did in the portal. It's just deploying an internal to that main VNet. So if I deploy that, which will be this one because it's got the no pip on there, go ahead and deploy that. We'll see that it's deployed and it got past the policy because the policy was only checking for that public IP. And we can see that it was successful. So if you get to this point, either through the portal or through code, and you know what your definition is, you can always go back out to policy if it will load. Oh, session expired, not fair. Okay, give me just a second. I'm gonna have to reload again to Azure. Anyways, I was gonna show you that you can copy paste your definition ID found in VS Code. So in that big output we had, let me throw this back up. In the big output we have the definition ID here. So you can copy this ID, this GUID, and you can paste it in the search in the definitions window, and it will pull it up. You don't have to search by the display name. And that's basically what I was going to show you there. But it looks like my session expired. So fun times. But that is it for if your resource is affected, how do you troubleshoot it? Basically, you figure out what the policy definition is trying to enforce, and you either become compliant or you request that lovely exemption. So as a summary, I know this was a pretty long one. I'm sorry to keep you guys so long, but we went over what Azure Policy is. We went over the perspective of you as a policy creator, how to interpret a definition, how to create it, how to write, understand, and deploy. We also looked at it from the perspective of maybe a developer who has an important deployment coming up and it's being blocked by one of those pesky policies, and how to understand that error and how to troubleshoot it. So that is it. The slides for this are available. They are on GitHub. My GitHub is Joshua-Donovan. And if you just go to /slides, which I'll post in the chat, you can find these slides there. I also have the links. So because the slides are saved as a PDF, they are not clickable, but I have all the links in the README for the slides as well. So you can click them from there. But at this point, I'll open it up to any questions everybody's got.
Awesome. Thank you, Joshua. I noticed too that with the parameters being applied at the definition level, but you can also apply parameters at the assignment level. So you can kind of float that up. So if you have, you can hard code, essentially, you could hard code things in the definition, but you could leave it as parameters. And then the assignment can provide those list of values. For example, I know what I've done in Terraform is used parameters at the definition layer, but also used a parameter file with Terraform itself. And it was basically passing in those list of values that I wanted to apply down through the assignment and to the definition itself. Have you played with that as well?
Yeah. So you're talking about using the parameters from the Terraform perspective to update your policy definition, essentially, right? Or are you talking about
that and the parameters, specifically the parameters in a definition?
Yeah. So the parameters in a definition, with using that default value that we talked about, I know it was in one of the slides with just a bunch of text on the screen. But using that default value, you can therefore set a default value. So essentially you're saying this is what I want it to be, unless the person passing a new parameter through the assignment decides it should be different.
Yeah, with the parameters on a definition layer or level, you can have an assignment. Let's say that you want to limit it to certain regions, for example, a Azure resource creation in certain regions. You could have a policy that is just US, and then here's the list of the regions applied down to the definition. But another policy could be applied that's just the UK, for example, and then here's a smaller list of the regions that are available there, and that you want to limit there. So you can still have two different definitions applying a list of parameter values through that to the definition layer.
Yeah. So you can have, I think, so you're talking about having two different assignments for the different regions that pass those values, down to the definition. Yeah, that's where it gets really powerful with the scoping through the assignment.
Yep. All right. Are there any other questions? You're more than welcome to come off of mute or put them into chat. I'll ask them on your behalf. Joshua, I definitely appreciate this. It was a great talk. I really appreciate it. And I highly recommend the use of policies. It can, and something else that you had touched on just very briefly, and that's a resource lock. I highly recommend that people use those as well. Resource locks are nice, but you only get just like two different levels of protection. One, I remember one of them is delete, and I forget what the other one is, but they apply so broadly that you're almost better off with policies, even though they're a bit more to understand. I have used policies to help me protect, because one of the things that I did was certainly when I was learning with Azure App Services. Is I believe I created an ACE, and I was like, well, I'm going to go play with this. I want to go learn about it, things like that. And about 2 days later, I looked at my spend, and my forecasted cost was going to be between $400 and $500 that month. So I immediately stopped what I was doing, deleted the ACE, and wrote a policy that says, if I'm in a development environment, how about I protect myself and others from just, very implied there, just creating anything that could be expensive. So how about limit it to certain things, as well as keeping the Azure resources inside a certain country, for example, things like that. And there's other controls you can do in Azure, but a policy is a great one that you can apply. And that's exactly what I did there first.
Yeah, keeping your costs down is a extremely popular use of Azure Policy. One of the better things you can do.
When you mentioned tags as well, I have a policy on a couple of different Azure subscriptions for requiring a tag called owner. So if I've got a group of developers or multiple teams of developers and they want to go create something, they have to specify who the owner is. That way we know if we're trying to figure out why is this so costly, well, then who did it? We can start with that supplied owner and kind of work our way backwards as to why was this done? Why is it, why did they choose that certain SKU, etc. Maybe other great reason for it, but at least we know who did what. And even with a policy applied at a resource group level, then we know who's been touching it, etc.
Yeah,
so
that's really good. So speaking on that, how are you having them deploy their tags? Are they doing it through like a pipeline, or have you seen where you can actually use Azure Policy to inherit tags from like the subscription or resource group level? Have you seen that before?
I have not worked with inheritance on that regard. I'm more over if there's any Azure resource created, it does require a tag of owner. I will say, and I'll kind of bring this up too, is that tags are case sensitive. So you could have owner with lowercase and owner with uppercase O, and that's two different tags. So I might use a remediation to see if I can streamline that, so that kind of combine those so that you're kind of more consistent in the spelling of that, to whatever your preference is. But I would definitely recommend that, just so you don't have owner and owner, two different spellings. But if at least it's specified, that's great, but help consolidate on that. The other thing too, while I'm mentioning tags, is the other reason I highly recommend tags is when you look at cost analysis through your Azure subscription, by using tags, say, for example, if you have a project tag and you have multiple resources created specifically for that, then you can see what your cost analysis is for a specific project, and regardless of the resource itself. So I definitely like tags regarding the cost analysis side of it.
Oh, did I direct message you with that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you did.
Why is it
No
doing
worries.
that?
Well, it's because I sent you a direct message, and therefore it defaulted your reply back to specifically me.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why.
All right. So what I posted there is the patterns of use for tags documentation. It goes through several scenarios there that are really good if you're interested in managing your tags using Azure Policy. Just wanted to make sure people knew that existed.
No, I think that's great. That's great. All right. Any last questions? All right.